Welcome back to this special edition of NCBA's Cattlemen to Cattlemen. We're joined by a panel of experts from Boehringer Ingelheim Vetmedica Incorporated to answer questions about biosecurity. Well, let's get right back to it. And I want to pick up, Dr. Devin, right where we left off. So let's assume that I've completed this risk assessment and I've identified a risk in my operation. What are the very next steps I should take?
Well, that depends on the nature of the risk, but let's consider that we have a risk for, let's say, BVD. So what we do is we set in place controls for the routes of introduction of that disease. So we look at animal movement in particular, particularly herd additions. How do we manage those? How do we deal with isolation? Do we keep them quarantined for a period of time? And it's probably a great idea to do some quarantine, particularly for those diseases that we may not see disease manifest in a very short period of time. We can look at vectors. Some diseases are carried by insect vectors, for instance. We can look at testing. We can test and identify those diseases, for some diseases, what our risk may be. We can look at potential for introduction of a pathogen by food or water. We can look at our vaccination practices. So there are a number of things that we can look at from a biosecurity standpoint to help us identify those risks. Now, oftentimes producers look on their veterinarian as somebody that comes for procedures like pregnancy testing or bull testing. We should look at that as, let's say we have an outbreak of disease and we treat it and we contain it, we deal with it, but we need to also at the same time look under that rock and see if there's another rock there that has the source of how that disease was introduced. So going beyond just dealing with the problem is where we begin to really make inroads with biosecurity.
Well, you talk about pregnancy testing and breeding soundness exams. Dr. Larson, I'd ask you, what experience have you had relative to reproductive diseases?
Yeah, there's a number of diseases that can cause some pretty severe reproductive losses in a cow herd. And the way we biosecure our ranch or farm so that we keep those diseases away is really critical. You know, for example, one of the diseases that I frequently work with producers with is bovine viral diarrhea, or BVD. It has a few interesting characteristics so that of the herds that I've worked with that have had devastating outbreaks, losses, and we really look under that rock and figure out where it came from and what went wrong to allow that to happen. There's really just a handful of things that are common in almost all of those situations. One of the ways that we frequently get BVD onto the farm is we bought it. We bought it in an animal we brought onto the farm, a pregnant animal or even an open animal, and we could have avoided that by combining some testing at the time we bought that animal with a quarantine period. So it's two of the things Dr. Devin talked about, so testing and quarantine. We can also minimize the losses that occurred in that situation by having a good vaccination program on the herd, having good herd immunity, so that even though if we make the mistake of allowing it to get on the farm, we can minimize the losses. The other way in ranches that I've been involved with where we've had a BVD outbreak and it gets on the farm and causes some pretty big reproductive losses is fence line contact. And so, you know, several of the tools that we deal with or use to deal with biosecurity, testing, quarantine, vaccination, and perimeter control are real world problems that I've run into with farms dealing with BVD, for one example.
Are there other reproductive diseases we should be concerned about, Dr. Payne?
Sure. You know, trichomoniasis is becoming a problem in Missouri here in the last few years, so I'll kind of walk through some of the ways that I've heard of this disease being introduced onto operations around the state. And it basically boils down to two different ways. Because this is a venereally transmitted disease, it's either purchased, much like BVD is, and we have an infected bull, or even a cow that recently aborted from trichomoniasis that is still carrying this organism. These provide sources in which it can be introduced into an operation. And at the same time, we may have a neighboring operation that is trich positive, and if the fences are in disrepair, we could have animals crossing back and forth across borders, bringing it in that way. And so when we look how to mitigate that risk, it basically boils down to what Dr. Larson and Dr. Devin have talked about, and that's isolation and testing, and make sure that we reduce that fence line or that potential of interaction with neighboring operation animals.
Kevin, what? Go ahead. Did you have
I was
a
going to
thought,
say
Bob?
one other thing that I've seen with trich is within a farm, you talk about perimeter control. A lot of times trich will start in one breeding pasture, and if we can confine it there with the perimeter control of that pasture and movement of animal control of that pasture, again, we can minimize the losses. Yes, we had the problem of letting it get on the farm in the first place, but if at least at that point we can clamp down and minimize the losses. So we talk a lot about bringing it in from out, preventing diseases from coming in from outside, but kind of in the second step is what do we do internally within our farm or ranch to limit those losses?
That's good. Kevin, what experience have you had in Texas?
Well, we have a common respiratory disease, IBR, which is a virus, infectious bovine rhinotracheatis, and we oftentimes think of it just solely as causing respiratory disease. But we have reproductive problems from that also, and especially where we run a lot of stocker cattle, and we've got stocker cattle across the fence from cows, and maybe these are high-risk stocker cattle. We get some IBR from some fence line contact. We can cause abortions. We can get vaginitis in some of those cows. We can have eye problems. All these things can be serious problems, and we oftentimes don't think of it as that kind of a disease. But where we run a lot of stocker cattle, especially in the winters on wheat pasture and things like this, it can be a real concern.
Dr. Payne, what signs should cause me to immediately call my vet?
Some of our foreign animal diseases, in particular foot and mouth disease, they show up as either erosions or ulcers or even vesicles on the muzzle, possibly in the mucosal lining of the mouth or on the tongue. And so if I was to come across a set of cattle that had those type of lesions, I'd want my veterinarian out there to see what the nature of those lesions are. And maybe it's just a disease that's common to North America, but at the same time, it's better to be safe than sorry. The other times in which I think it's important, and most people would realize this, but being that a new disease being introduced onto an operation, the cattle are naive to that disease, we can see a significant increase in death loss or sickness. And so that occurs with foreign animal diseases quite commonly. So we would want a veterinarian to come out to the operation in those situations where we do have a high death loss and a high level of sickness that is unexplained.
Dr. Larson, it strikes me one of the key differences between a cow-calf operator and, let's say, a swine producer, a dairyman, some feedlots, is that we're running in big country, we're running with lots of neighbors, there's lots of fence line contact and so forth. What are the kinds of things that cow-calf producers should keep in mind as they develop a biosecurity plan?
I think that's a good point. Compared to other livestock operations, cow-calf operations have a very large perimeter. In some ways, that's a good thing. A lot of the disease agents that we deal with, it really helps to have cattle spread out. We can minimize the contact between animals. We can slow down the spread of disease. So in some ways, the fact that cow-calf operations are spread over large areas is to our benefit. Where it hurts us is the fact that we have a very large perimeter. Therefore, we really have a very difficult time controlling access of our cattle herd to wildlife. Much more of a problem than some of the other livestock operations that we talk about. The other thing is we will oftentimes have basically the same species right across the same fence. And again, you think about a swine operation or a feedlot or a dairy, they're not likely to have cattle or swine just right across the fence. There's going to be a buffer area before you'd run into the same species that's not managed by me. Whereas in a cow-calf situation, it's very common to have fence line contact with another operation. So they've got another health, a level of biosecurity, another health program that they've implemented. And so that raises some challenges because of that ability to pass diseases across fences.
Well, it sounds like then communication and cooperation with your neighbors is really important. Kevin, what would you say to that?
Well, I think it's very important to remember that a lot of the diseases we deal with are neighborhood diseases. And I think you've got to work with your neighbors and be alert and talk to them and their employees and your employees, and everybody have a lot of communication, because it always helps to have an extra set of eyes on the problem. And I think that neighbors should be even involved in making your biosecurity plan, where everybody's working together, going back and forth, and so that we know what each other's concerns are, we know what to look for, and that we help each other out. It's just imperative.
And Dr. Devin, it sounds like clearly a biosecurity plan would differ based on the diseases that are prevalent in my particular area, but what guidance could you give us about just some of the fundamentals to a sound biosecurity program?
Okay. Depending on the disease, we'd like to have at least a couple of stops to try to mitigate the effect of that disease. So in some cases, for instance, BVD that we talked about, controlling animal movement, but also testing would be two things that we could do. If we're talking about something like leptospirosis, which is housed in wild animals to a large degree, then we're looking at the potential for controlling those reservoirs and also controlling exposure to those reservoirs with the livestock. So it's dependent upon the disease. The veterinarians are trained to know how those diseases are transmitted, and so they can help guide the producer based on specific diseases or even on common routes of transmission to help stop those gaps.
Well, this is a really insightful conversation, and I hate to interrupt us, but we need to take another quick break. We'll be back with more in-depth discussion on the role biosecurity plays on reproductive health just after this. Stay with us.